Okay, welcome. Today I wanted to offer some reflections about childhood neglect and why its impact is as damaging, if not more so, than abuse. So today I am just going to be sharing a few thoughts and ideas from the work of David Howe, who wrote the book Child Abuse and Neglect. I am interviewing David in 2 weeks' time, and so I've been reading through his book and just getting some ideas for that interview. So while I was preparing for today's video, I was reading through Gabor, I was reading through Judith Herman, her book Trauma and Recovery, and I was also looking at Bessel Van der Kolk, who wrote the book The Body Keeps the Score. And interestingly, in the index, might be in the book, but in the index there's no reference in any of those three books to neglect. And it's really interesting because Simon Partridge, who I interviewed on my podcast a few years ago, he's quoted in Nick Duffel's book saying that there is a growing consensus backed by neuroscience and amongst traumatologists that neglect is even more damaging to the developing child and its brain than acute abuse. And I'll share some ideas from this. So that's why I find it fascinating that neglect is not talked about in the Bibles. I consider Judith Herman's work, Bessel Van der Kolk, and also Gabor. So fascinating, and also obviously talking and relating that back into boarding school, which is the key area I work with, is looking through, there's that reference in Nick Duffel's work to Simon Partridge, and again with Joy Shavrin. There probably are references, but in the index it's not that easy to find references. So it's almost like a hidden area for me. So that's why I'm kind of fascinated to talk a little bit about this today. So if I share a little bit from the NSPCC. So the NSPCC talks about neglect, and neglect is the ongoing failure to meet a child's basic needs and the most common form of child abuse. They also go on to say child might be left hungry or dirty, without proper clothing, supervision, shelter or healthcare. This can put a child and young person in danger, and they also say it can also have long-term effects on their physical and mental well-being. So the NSPCC talk about 4 different types of neglect: physical neglect, educational neglect, emotional neglect, and medical neglect. And physical neglect is, like that first phrase said, a child's basic needs such as food, clothing, shelter. They're not met, or they aren't properly supervised or kept safe. Educational neglect, parent doesn't ensure their child is given an education. Then emotional neglect, child doesn't get the nurture and stimulation they need. These are all words from the NSPCC's website. This could be through ignoring, humiliating, intimidating, or isolating them. And then the final one, medical neglect. A child isn't given proper health care. This includes dental care, refusing or ignoring medical recommendations. They go on to say neglect changes childhood. Children who've been neglected might experience short-term and long-term effects. So this is a really interesting, and next week I'll do a video about that. I'll do a little sharing about how I feel neglect and boarding school overlap. But this for today is more about developmental trauma, more about neglect. So again, as Gabor says in his work, he says developmental trauma, this is repeated or prolonged exposure to adversity during development, such as abuse, neglect, or being raised in a chaotic or unpredictable environment. So I think we can see neglect is in there, so it's a developmental trauma. So let me read from David Howe and his work. So David Howe was a professor, he's now retired, but the School for Social Work and Psychosocial Sciences, the University of East Anglia, Norwich in UK. So what he says about neglect, he says neglect is an insidious form of maltreatment. It starves the developing mind of stimulation. It denies the child information and interest about the self and others. In other cases, according to Erickson and Engeland, neglect slowly and persistently eats away at a children's spirits until they have little will to connect with or explore the world. He goes on to say some of the characteristics, things like nutrition can be poor, clothes are old or dirty or too big, nappies are not changed, babies seem to suffer rashes, permanently sore bottoms. Children's hair is often lank, wispy and thin. Many are often enuretic and prone to one minor illness after another. Children who are neglected are often smelly, scruffy, and so become the easy targets of peer taunts, rejection and bullying. Bedrooms are sparsely furnished and cold. Children are left unsupervised and understimulated. As a result, accidents and injuries are common. School attendance can be poor. Neglected children's development is often impaired physically, educationally and emotionally. They are tired, apathetic and suffer various skin complaints. And he goes on to say, he says, and this is kind of linking that in, or maybe that's more next week, but talking about emotional neglect, he says emotional neglect denies children psychological recognition and emotional understanding. Erickson and Egeland, 2002, usefully see emotional neglect as a form of psychological unavailability. This is particularly pernicious while children are still very young. So, yeah, just some thoughts really about neglect in childhood. So it's kind of really seeing the importance of it. It's like we've kind of pushed it to one side, or we're not necessarily talking about it, but I see that, as Simon Partridge says, you know, it is more damaging to the developing child and its brain than acute abuse. And he goes on to share the work of Camila Batmanghelidjh, and she says, because abuse, however awful, has a beginning and a middle and an end, for the child, neglect goes on forever. So that's why she's saying, and why they're saying, that neglect is even more damaging than abuse, because for abuse there's a beginning, a middle and an end. For the child, neglect goes on forever. So yeah, just some reflections there really about childhood neglect. So maybe that's something you can resonate with. Maybe you had that. So the invitation is to take care, seek out professional help, and start. If you have been neglected, the chances are that you neglect yourself now. Maybe you don't take care on certain levels. You don't rest. You don't eat very well. You're always stressed. The invitation is just to slow down, take a breath, start that self-care, getting to bed early, having a lovely bath, eating well, good company, taking time off work. So really taking care of the self. So David Howe's interview will go live probably 3 weeks time, 2.5 weeks. So I will share that on this channel. So any questions about neglect, please do let me know, and next week I will do a video about how I see boarding school is a neglect. So bless you, take care.